I have been looking forward to joining you as your bishop on the occasion of your 70th anniversary of gospel ministry, of loving God and loving your neighbors right here in Islington, on your patronal festival, and also on this day of confirmation. I think you've squeezed everything possible into one Sunday, Stephen, right? But friends, it is good to be here. And whether you are new and spiritually searching here this morning, or you've been a member of St. Matt's for every one of those 70 years, I'm so glad that you're here and you are so welcome here. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, wrote an article in the New York Times a few years ago, and it was a plea to the American government to resist bombing Syria. Two lines that Vladimir Putin wrote jumped out at me. This is the first one. No one doubts that poison gas was used in Syria, but there's every reason to believe it was not used by the Syrian army, but by opposition forces. Don't be so sure you know who the bad guys are, Putin warns. Everyone has blood on their hands. And at the end of the article, he wrote this: we're all different, but when we ask for the Lord's blessing, we must not forget that God created us equal. Now, this is Vladimir Putin. He's playing politics, but it's also fascinating. Everyone has blood on their hands. We're all equal. What do those two things mean if you put them together? Almost all literature and media are based on the assumption that the world is divided into good people versus evil people, of varying shades, of course. And Disney would not be able to produce a movie without such an assumption, right? And what parent has not played some version of good guys versus bad guys? And yet we have the last verse of our gospel reading today, the calling of Matthew to follow Jesus. And this is what Jesus says: "For I have come not to call the righteous, but to call sinners." I've come to call sinners. And the assumption here, from the Christian point of view, is that the world is not divided into good guys and bad guys. That's not the Christian view. The Christian view is we're all in the same boat. And it's the Matthew boat. It's the boat full of tax collectors, a boat full of sinners, a boat full of Stephens and Jennys and Brits and you. And hearing that we're all in the same boat, all sinners, and yet all equally called to follow Jesus, as Stephen was telling the children just a little earlier, that's both deeply challenging and it's wonderfully liberating. And so this morning, as we give thanks to God for the past 70 years, and we turn our faces towards the future of St. Matt's, let's spend a little bit of time this morning thinking about those challenging yet liberating words of Jesus. I've come not to call the righteous, but to call sinners. Now, I probably don't need to convince you that the world is a beautiful place, right? It's a wonderful place, full of wonder and joy and wonderful things. But it's also not a completely happy place. You just turn on the news and you know that. But the problems of the world are not just out there. The Christian faith is incredibly realistic. It says the problems of the world don't start out there, they start right here in my heart. We all have our issues. And we probably all have friends and loved ones who've said things like this: I don't see what the point of being a Christian is. It doesn't really matter what you believe. What matters is being a good person, right? Being a nice person. And what they usually mean is, let's just be Canadian together, right? Right? We too. But in 1866, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote the classic novel, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll comes to realize that he is, and I quote, an incongruous compound of good and evil. He thinks his bad nature is holding his good nature back. And because he wants to do so many things, he's discouraged that he can't follow them through. So he comes up with a magic potion. And this potion is to separate out his two natures, to separate out his good nature from his bad nature. And what he hopes is that during the daytime, this potion will let only his good nature come out, and so that he can accomplish all the good things in life that he wants to do. However, when he takes the potion one night, his bad side comes out far more evil than he expected. Edward Hyde, who Dr. Jekyll turns into at nighttime, is named that not because he is disfigured, but because he is hidden. Mr. Hyde. Stevenson is saying that even the best of people hide from themselves what is within, their capacity for self-absorption. And I think he's right. I'm a mixture of good and bad. My capacity for self-absorption is significant. I text while I walk, and I can't even remember to bring my recyclable cup when I go to buy my morning coffee. It's pretty pathetic, right? But seriously, my capacity to do evil, my personal capacity, has simply been restrained by my good fortune of having grown up in a loving home, of having had an education, and being part of a Christian community that's challenged me. And if we seek to build our identity on being a good person, then we need to think of ourselves as good people all the time. And this ultimately lets you down. It's so discouraging. When I was a young adult, it caused me so much anxiety because I thought I was a good person, yet I kept making all these mistakes and hurting people. And I'm like, why? How do I do these things? I'm a good person. Why can't I control myself? But as I learned more and more in my 20s about what Jesus said, and I came to understand Jesus' message of forgiveness and renewal, I realized I no longer had to think of myself as a good person. I gotta tell you, it was such a psychological relief. It was one of the most freeing, liberating moments of my young life. And how might coming to see ourselves as a mixture of good and bad shape our lives for the future? How might the fact that we are sinners, loved by Jesus, be a positive thing for the future of St. Matthew's? Well, in our reading today, which Stephen explained to the children, Jesus is having dinner at that tax collector Matthew's house, your namesake. And as Stephen pointed out, it's easy to forget how utterly loathed tax collectors were. And none of us particularly like being taxed, but we probably wouldn't spit at somebody if they told us they were a tax accountant, or throw a brick through the window of the local H&R Block, right? Any tax accountants here? None that are going to put their hands up, right? But Matthew would have been hated. As Stephen said, he worked for the occupying Roman forces. And not only was he collecting money from his Jewish brothers and sisters, he was allowed by the Romans to take more, right, to line his pockets. So in typical Jesus fashion, Jesus is having dinner with the modern day equivalent of a drug dealer or a child pornographer, a hated member of society. The Pharisees are confused. What are you doing eating with him? Because the Pharisees were religious leaders who were particularly focused on leading exemplary lives, on being very good people. And they built their sense of identity on their moral performance in life. They kind of presented it as a resume to God, a resume to the world. Look how good I am. But the moral standards that they tried to uphold were exceedingly high. And they knew at night, just like Mr. Hyde, they knew at night that they were never fully living up to them. Which is why even the physical presence of Jesus, the one person who did meet their moral standards, they used to irritate them beyond belief. Just got under their skin. It's why when I go to the gym, I get so irritated by the women working out who don't need to go to the gym, right? Boy, it bugs me. The Pharisees knew they weren't praying as often as they could. They knew they weren't loving their neighbors as themselves or keeping their inner thoughts pure. And this resulted in a great insecurity, a great irritability, and this Pharisaical religion, this need to live up to being a good person. It doesn't just damage our psyche, it's also the source of all social discord. The Pharisees needed to shore up their sense of being good people, so they attacked anybody who didn't share their beliefs. And at its most extreme, this is what leads to all forms of social exclusion. You're not like me, I'm going to exclude you because it makes me feel better about myself. But knowing that myself is a mixture of good and evil means I can't be defensive when I'm criticized. And it's the same knowledge that urges me towards charity rather than critique towards those with whom I disagree. So if it's dangerous to build our identity, to build our future on thinking of ourselves as good people or thinking of this as a good church, then how do we actually live the lives that we want? What is St. Matthew's next 70 years going to look like? What's it going to be based on? How do we have compassion with our partners and spouses as they suffer illness or you go through financial stress? What are you going to do? How are you going to have courage to care for your aging parents or babies who are cluster feeding at 2 a.m.? Right? What are we going to do with our conflicted selves? Well, of course you knew there'd be good news here, right? The Christian faith gives us an alternative. It shows us that we can be renewed, that we can be dug up and replanted. And St. Matthew's this morning is being dug up and being replanted. What do I mean by this? Well, I want you to imagine that you're a peach tree farmer. Can you do that? Can you think of yourself as a peach tree farmer? Okay, you plant peach trees. And one day, this peach tree farmer realizes that he's sick of peaches and he wants to grow apples. He does some research on how to grow apples. Some people say to him, well, you just need to prune your peach trees back. Prune them all the way back and then they'll start growing apples. Tries that, cuts back the dead branches, but of course, there are no apples. So some other people say, why don't you start sticking some apples onto the branches of the peach tree and see if that gets apples growing? Of course it doesn't. If you really want to grow apples instead of peaches, what have you got to do? You got to dig up the peach trees and you got to plant apple trees, right? We all know this, right? This is so obvious. And we laugh at the silly peach tree farmer. But my friends, this is what we all do, myself included. When we get the tiniest glimpse that we need God in our lives, maybe for the first time, or maybe in a renewed way, you have a particular sense of emptiness or lack of purpose, or if we sense that we're being called by God to live a simpler life, what do we try to do? We turn into peach tree farmers. We might try and prune ourselves, stop a particular habit that we know is damaging, or we try the other option. We try to stick apples on, right? We might read a self-improvement book, or we might give more money to the church. Still a very good thing to do. But especially this church, right? But if we really want to grow apples, we need to be dug up and replanted. And this is what Christians call receiving God's grace. Receiving God's grace. It's what Britt is going to publicly do when she's confirmed this morning. Grace is God's love and mercy given to us, something that we don't deserve, something that God freely gives. And grace means that there's nothing we can do to make God love us more. There's no apples we need to stick on. And this makes us humble. And grace means there's nothing we could do that would ever make God love us less. What a relief. It can give you confidence. And today we hear that while we're like Jekyll and Hyde, which is a challenging thing to be told, we can rejoice because we're still incredibly precious in God's eyes. See, the wonderful thing is God is the one person who knows exactly what I'm like. Right? Even more than my husband. And he knows plenty of the warts. But God's the one person who knows exactly what I'm really like and still totally delights in me. That is such good news. Receiving God's grace, something we don't deserve, of being replanted by God's love and mercy, is wonderful good news. Because you see, the world runs on the opposite. The world runs on ungrace, of having to earn everything. You know, you make your bed, you lie in it. That's ungrace. Everything depending on what I do. Am I good enough? But Jesus offers us another way. One that depends not on our performance, but on His. We do not have to achieve. All we need to do, as Stephen told the children, is follow. There's so much to celebrate today. We can celebrate being truly known and yet deeply loved by God. We're celebrating God's faithfulness to this community of forgiven sinners for 70 years. We're celebrating how God has used you in your homes, in your places of work, and in this neighborhood for 7 decades. You've been showing God's love, sharing the love of Jesus, your mission statement. And we're celebrating the future that God is holding out to you. Because God already knows all the mistakes that we've all made as a community and people, and still God goes before us, calling us ahead. And as I end, I want to thank you. Thank you for being a faithful Christian community. A community that also wants to share the love of Jesus with the next generation. You've been willing to make prayerful changes to your Sunday morning services. You're hosting Messy Church, many other things, so that the next generation can know the love of Jesus the way that it was shared to you by the generation that went before you. This evolution and adaptation is what Anglicans have been doing for centuries. Thank you. And there will undoubtedly be more evolutions and adaptations that God calls you to in the future. But don't be afraid. God will give you the courage and the hope to follow. Thank you to Stephen for his dedicated leadership. You're doing a wonderful job, Stephen. Thank you to Merv. Thank you to Thomas. Now to Seth, to your wardens, Stuart, Karen, Ian, and all of you here, all your lay leaders, for all your sacrifice, for all your service. God's grace is free on tap today for all to receive, in confirmation, in the bread and in the wine. Food for that journey of following Jesus. Let the past 70 years strengthen you, not to look back, but to move forward, following that God of grace. Amen.
Amen.